Chapter 6. The Next Meeting with Mr. Tiberias. At which point Mr. Tiberias's methods are revealed to be something much darker than they seem. Soon after Cameron fell asleep, he found that his mind rapidly began irking him so ceaselessly that he couldn't get a wink of sleep. However, at about 1:30 in the morning, he fell into a semi-lucid kind of doze. He often fell asleep right after getting in his bed, only to wake up later in the night. But he was ill at ease and anxious about the grisly prospect of Mr. Tiberias in the real world, and as soon as he thought about that unsettling creature, he heard an audible creaking noise arise from a few paces in front of him, next to the closet door. He was stiff in his bed and felt as if he couldn't budge an inch. He saw the shadow of something pass over the moonlight, a shadow in the shape of a pair of stocky legs with a mammoth spherical form above it. It didn't take much further speculation to deduce who it was.
"Ah, my good earthly friend, we meet again under even stranger circumstances."
It was him. He was entirely visible after taking a few steps from the side of the shadows and began walking into the moonlight. He was wearing a similar outfit as before, but with an ascot tie, burgundy coattails, cream-colored slacks, and a different cane. His eye scanned the room, then its ghoulish, voyeuristic pupil focused directly on Cameron. He felt far more uncomfortable than he had in their first meeting. "What is it you want?" Cameron asked, endeavoring not to make direct eye contact with him, but finding it extraordinarily difficult, as the eye appeared to have a kind of glacial luminescence that pierced through the darkness.
"I was just visiting town. It's an interesting little city, this place. While it is entirely uncultivated, they retain a certain rustic warmth and a down-to-earth nature. While the bars disappointed me, I found an exemplary Irish-style pub that I've ensconced myself in for the last few hours, debating to myself whether I should see you in person. Yes, this is in person, this odd idea in my head of me coming to you rather than the other way around. I concluded that it would be less hectic for you, not having to go through that bedlam again. That Cecil, or the girl with the invisible faces I've taken to calling her, is quite the sweetheart. I passed by her on Market Street while she was shopping. It was difficult to recognize her at all, a certain quality and marvel about her despite all appearances, but
Given her current conditions?
Don't worry, I didn't talk to her, but I saw you two conversing, so naturally it just broke my heart to see you remain so stolid and apathetic in the face of such a beauty. Have you no spirit?
I never knew such a girl would choose to live in such a derelict, decaying conurbation.
Don't worry, I only jest."
Cameron clenched his fists intolerantly as Mr. Tiberias spoke. "How did you even know about her?" Cameron demanded. "I thought you could only stay in that sewer." "That's why I refuse to believe that you're here. It's impossible." Mr. Tiberias edged slightly closer, startling Cameron even more as he now appeared realer than ever, and not at all like a simulacrum of something purely cerebral. He spoke with usual sardonic drawl, interspersed with occasional stentorian, passionate tone. "It matters not whether you feel that it is impossible. The fact is that I can appear anywhere I like now. Soon there will be no limitations to my actions. It just so happens that my beloved consulate has afforded me some newly required and rightfully earned luxuries. I can meld into abstractions on a whim. I can bend the confines of reality to my liking. Have you no faith? Be as a child. Remember, you gave me your seal of trust. You have merely extended my leash. How do you know if anything is merely a dream, or a true phenomenon in this ever-deceitful world of appearances? How do you know what is real and what is only phantasmagorical? Even in your current waking state, you are more asleep than you were in your supposed dreams, especially in that sewer where you and I had the most edifying of conversations. Where did that Cameron go? Now, with your bleary-eyed lethargy, you write me off. Did you forget about the little discourses we had and the progress we made? Did those momentous adventures in suspended geometric space slip your mind so easily? So, you have forgotten completely about me. I suppose even the most illuminating of books, the tenderest of poems, and the theories of old are but the contents of dreams. Even the best minds suffer amnesia. Consider the maddening antics of Lord Byron, Keats, or the unfortunately gloomy demise of Friedrich Hölderlin. Every day we see what is before us and incorrectly regard it as factual, compelling, empirical matter.
But we are betrayed, and falsely claim that what our eyes present to us is truthful. I choose not to believe this facsimile. The real thing is leagues away and remains unattainable, unless you are willing to make some sacrifices. Yet I speak of a different kind of truth, a higher strain of it, the most optimal versions of the god Apollo in the Greek tragedy and choruses of Euripides spoke so fervently. Every day, underneath your nose, apparitions of beasts and creatures seep from under the very fabric of reality, and you can only see their shadows obtrude. Though seldom is it explicit, you vaguely see their claws vying for freedom amid the clouds of nebulae. I see you giving me that disgruntled look. Do you tire of my lengthy polemics, my friend? Are they finally getting to you? That is entirely understandable. I bore myself to sleep sometimes. But I couldn't take another day of moseying around that cursed dungeon of a room with only my endless books and a talking ear to keep me company. To be honest, that damn ear is known for his excessive complaining about trivial matters. He'll even talk my own ear off. Yet I found the escape into the deepest recesses of my intellect, and my compendium of manifestos, strategies, and political partisanships has led me to yearn to become wholly idealist. To not know or comprehend anything at all would be a blissful enterprise that we should all strive for. To be akin to that impoverished boy I mentioned, who revels in the little miracles of daily life rather than aimlessly compounding the intellect. For what good does excessive banter, trading, mulling over the concepts and equations of men who are long dead do us? None. It is true that when we devote ourselves only to one task, be it music, wherein we may devote several hours of perfecting a piece, we may experience intense inundation and dissatisfaction. We feel overwhelmed if we absorb too much of one thing, despite how dearly we may love it. The same is true of any physical activity. We must learn to detach and rest in order to recover and glean new growth and insights. A similar theme arises for intellectual pursuits. You cannot and mustn't commit yourself for far too many hours on end to an idea that is taking shape or a book that needs writing, as you will surely break down. What is more important is balance between all those things. Pathos, logic, ethos, and karos are all key factors in determining how we approach the ever-growing world of our minds. We spend so much time with our hands in the external world, trying to venture outside ourselves in order to gain a better understanding of who we might be, that we only succeed in denying our inner worlds and souls that need to be tended to. Our minds are akin to gardens that need a balance between air, oxygen, and sustenance. How often do we actually walk in these gardens and see the fruit that is capable of blooming so exquisitely? How often do we dig deep and contend with the depth of our own nature, while captivating possibilities can arise in an instant? Or even a fraction of a melody stringing together into a melodious harmony, or a notion so enthralling that we may lose our sense of grounding in the real world and immerse ourselves in our daydreaming. The world needs more dreamers with the tenacity to drink deep of that cup of boundless creativity and the sore, world-weary contemplation that comes with it. These processes, you will learn, reinforce each other. There is a season for weeping, and one for rejoicing. There is a mode of life which transitions from a dry spell of fruitless nullity to a period where the life force of inventiveness bursts forth from us like a hot spring which has been lying underneath thousands of years of sedentary volcanic rock, awaiting its due time. Without such people, the world would be akin to a map without a legend or a compass. What we require now more than ever are those bold enough to individuate and extricate themselves from the temporal folly of this world and to put their stake into something higher, an ideal, a conviction that may seem preposterous in the moment but will ultimately benefit you profoundly later on in life. We need not idle men who defer to expedient pleasures. Woe to those who seek the safe life of the quiet desperation Thoreau spoke of. Though to be truthful, many such men likely have never shed a tear since they were infants. They never had the guile to appreciate a great piece of art, so mesmerizing they become delirious like a Stendhal character. Never do they regret the road not taken. They live facile, dormant lives that lead to mediocrity. Their lives are tragedies. Your life has been a tragedy, Cameron. However, you chose to take a different road, a higher calling that led you to me. Though it was in a sewer where you and I first spoke, it was the most transcendent, sacrosanct places you've ever been. The church has cast you out or ignored you. Your compatriots see no value in you. Your family hasn't seen you for years. Oddly enough, you found hope in that sewer. Additionally,
You recently asserted yourself with your superior, and for now, that is enough." And with that, Mr. Tiberias simply disappeared. Following Tiberias' hasty exit, Cameron did in fact fall into a deep sleep, but was tortured by even more portentous thoughts, imageries, and fantasies. Mr. Tiberias had only exacerbated his already frenzied state, and he tossed back and forth restlessly as the thoughts multiplied and disquieted him. Frightful images flashed before him, with prominent one being a heavy-set, tall man in a corporate environment, stampeding through an office like an unrestrained bull that charged through its surroundings with no intention of stopping. The figure of the man, or what appeared to be the man, as only its shadow is seen, hopped back and forth hysterically as it turned over the tables and tossed the desks around the room. Before long, there were several more of these same figures, multiplying at a frequent, disarming rate, and they all took to soaring throughout the office, so their shadows, too, were cast against the wall. When they did this, even more of them arose from the wall, which looked like a dark canvas with a simple mural of a horizon on it. The horizon was set against the backdrops of a city skyline, and the sky was blood red in the most portentous way. Everything seemed tinged with terror and dread. The shadow creature continued to torment the office, wherein several real people were going about their work. They vaguely resembled the actual people that worked with Cameron, but with minute variations. A figure wearing full black stood with his back to Cameron, who approached him with uncertainty. He timorously put his hands on his shoulders, prompting the man to turn around. From behind, it had looked deceptively normal and untainted, but as he turned, Cameron saw a dreadful, dark void where his face would have been. Cameron was so frightened that he screamed, but found that he had lost his voice no matter how forcefully he used his lungs. His fears were compounded when he saw a whole host of other workers who appeared in a similar fashion, all faceless, antagonistic, hostile creatures who slowly made their way toward him. Cameron did the only thing anyone in their right mind would do, even in a dream: run. However, after they managed to sprint to a considerable distance, he noticed something going awry. His legs began to tense up into a frigid shape and slowly break and fall off as if they were fractious Fabergé eggs that shattered bleakly into innumerable pieces. "Damn it! Just leave me alone, you monsters!" Again, Cameron couldn't utter a word, not even a whisper, and obviously his attempts to do so were fruitless. The walls of this apparent office broke down as if they didn't even matter, and the idea of it being an office was just an arbitrary construct that had come tumbling down. It looked like the whole thing was a silly, painful joke, like a kind of Potemkin village in which the artificial, visible layer had been the only thing that mattered. Around the walls, which looked like they were made of styrofoam, was an intense, wide, black expanse of darkness. It looked similar to the black void that had been visible in the non-Euclidean space that Mr. Tiberias had put him through. Following this, Cameron noticed the ominous shape of something peculiar taking form, a giant eyeball that was rolling unforgivably down an incline. There was no telling what it could do. Even in this nightmarish scenario, the prospect of being crushed by an object of that magnitude was unsettling. So Cameron did all he could do, as he still had no legs and crawled using only his arms, looking for the nearest sanctuary. There were not very many options. He needed a crevice, a crawl space, or even a desk, anything that could temporarily shield him from the terror of that wretched eyeball that pursued him without mercy. Fortunately, there was a large filing cabinet that made for an ersatz kind of barrier, and which was just large enough for him to jump inside. Yet that giant eyeball saw everything, levitated using some unseen force, and promptly tumbled down the hill toward him with unequaled speed, ruthlessly crushing Cameron. At this point, he awoke from an uneasy, frantic sweat and rapidly sought for a drink of water. He arose from his bed, which was soaked with perspiration. He felt his ribs and took note that they ached considerably. He rushed into the kitchen, greedily gulped down a glass of water, and sat on his bed cogitating over the terrifying nightmare. What did it mean? Was it a presage of some unavoidable fate, or should it be dismissed altogether as a meaningless dream? Cameron started his routine for the day early by consulting his doctor. He was apprehensive about doing so. Would he be written off as crazy? Was there any merit, surreal, and even impossible experiences? Having a vivid nightmare about a giant eyeball chasing you is one thing, but claiming to have been transported to a gutter to speak with a sentient eyeball and ear was entirely different. He decided upon confiding with his doctor only the preliminary details. and once he had established a connection, to possibly admit to the more bizarre details later. Picking up the phone to dial, he rehearsed in his head exactly how he wanted to tell them of his troubles. He would only tell them that he was having a spell of bad dreams, ask for psychological advice, and explain that his sleeping schedule was being negatively affected by said dreams. So he wanted some kind of medication that would remedy them. He was met on the other end on the line by the polite, mild-mannered, but painfully candid Dr. Desmond Eakins, whose voice bore an uncannily resemblance to Robin's, which initially made him uncomfortable. It had a low, baritone timbre, almost on the verge of monotone. "This is Dr. Eakins, managing physician at West Blainsville Hospital. How can I help you today?" "I've been having very strange, upsetting dreams that have become recurring. But you see, they aren't just any kind of dreams. They're nightmares through and through, and they've been affecting my sleep. I can hardly even get an hour of rest." "Could you tell me the details of these dreams? I could be more of help if you give a rough summary of how they come about, what their duration is, and lastly, how similar in terms of theme and substance-wise." Dr. Eakins sounded as if he were reciting from a chart, but willing to help, which reassured Cameron. "Sure. They normally, if I could put a number on it, come up at about 1 to 2 in the morning and last for roughly 1 to 3 hours. But it's difficult to tell. Typically, they pertain to a kind of intense stress being thrust upon me, like I'm being transported to some capsule somewhere, and I'm helplessly caught at the mercy of these terrible, awful monsters of some kind. Like the last time I saw these people who appeared normal at first, but when they turned around, they had no faces and they just chased me around. Then I was chased and crushed by this giant eyeball. It was so lucid and tangible, I could almost feel my bones break." "A giant eyeball?" Dr. Eakins echoed dubiously. "Well, that's about 1/3 through your REM cycle. During this cycle, your mind produces the most brain activity, while the physical body slips into low muscle contraction. It's very important that these sleeping patterns remain uninterrupted through the night so you can process information. That's why there is so much tension during them. It's when the mind is most apt to produce frightening dreams. There's also sleep paralysis, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's when you think you're asleep, with your eyes open, but your body is immobile and unable to speak, and your dreams still occur. Which leads me to my next question. Are you experiencing that at all? Are you able to move throughout these intense dreams, or are you not aware of your bodily movements?" Cameron was thrown a little off at so many questions being asked at once, but was able to respond. "Well, I do consider myself to be a light sleeper normally, but I've been having more vivid dreams as of late. They get more and more realistic to the point where it's hard to tell whether I'm dreaming at all." "Is there anything particularly stressful occurring in your daily life that might bring about stress or anxiety?" asked Dr. Eakins. Cameron immediately pictured Mr. Singer and some of the crew at his office. "My job could be considered stressful. It's definitely not unusual to experience violent dreams within these sleeping states. In fact, they are most common. I would not characterize you as having any kind of disorder. You're still relatively young, in healthy shape, and don't have a history of violence, right?" Again, Dr. Eakins adopted a doubtful tone. "That's right. I don't have any history of violence, though I wouldn't say I'm in tip-top shape. On top of that, while you're here, my left eye has been giving me some trouble too. Nothing too much, just some aching." "Yes, I could send you to a neurologist or a sleep professional, an eye specialist for further help. I'm just a humble managing physician, though I can lead you in the right direction. Although, I'm afraid we may not be able to diagnose or treat you if you are not experiencing any symptoms associated with any kind of disorder. For example, because these dreams are happening when you're immobile, you're not going around the house posing any danger to yourself or anyone else. So we can only prescribe medication that can assist you in suppressing the symptoms. Getting to the root of the issue is what we intend to do with every patient, not just to blithely hand out pills. Would this Friday at 1:30 p.m. work?" "Yes, that would work perfectly. The sooner I can get this taken care of, the better." With that, Cameron hung up, exhaling with a sense of hope. That Friday, he drove to West Blainsville Medical Center. After struggling to find parking, settled for a tiny space at the far end of the lot. While the hospital wasn't a prize example of architecture, it was actually, oddly enough, better designed and more capacious than the ones offered by East Blainsville. It had 2 floors, a cafeteria, and the waiting period was shorter. However, there is typically a lot of trouble coming from the West Plainsville patients that frequent to it, whatever it took to sabotage this rare place of respite and proper medical care, including damaging the patient care rooms and interior to the building. Even the outdoor areas, such as the garden, were not spared their thoughtless littering, or even worse, utter vandalization to the statues in the face of the building. If it weren't for this, the West Plainsville Medical Center would have been perfect for senior folk, but the rumors of vandalism and theft, especially at night, dissuaded many people from attending it. Nevertheless, the medical staff was the best around as far as Cameron was concerned. They were professional, tactful, honest, if not a bit terse, and somewhat rough around the edges, as a response to the characteristically quarrelsome West Plainsville types. Cameron felt safe in their hands. As he traipsed across the lot, Cameron took note of the new paint job that had recently been added on the hospital walls, among the somewhat rigid, harsh, yet fresh design, which had included a row of recessed windows reinforced with bulletproof glass, solar reflective index pavers, a pair of cooling towers, and a rooftop garden. It seemed that the mayor had a sudden change of heart concerning the gentrification of West Plainsville, and ultimately decided it was best to start the arduous grand vision of reforming the rugged town into something more closely resembling civilized society, i.e. East Plainsville, which, as we've seen, was superior in terms of economy, society, and real estate. When Cameron observed these buildings in comparison to the somber ghettos of downtown West Plainsville, the hospital, despite being average by all means when held up to the rest of the country, appeared extravagantly classy, and for that reason the local residents both loved and hated it. Why hated it, you ask? Well, some of the people of the city were deeply accustomed to viewing their hometown with its downfalls with a sense of awed pride, and resorting to East Plainsville folk for one-upping them in class, architecture, and a host of other advantages they had up their sleeve. As a result, West Plainsville citizens could only compare themselves against and remain forever in the shadow of Easterners, no matter how much they improved. In a similar manner, the members of East Plainsville had only their opposite neighbors to contrast them with. If they had never been at West Plainsville, a seedy, dismal, urban area compared to which they could appear better and healthier in every domain, then those Easterners wouldn't have any standard to hold themselves against. Say what you will about West Plainsville as being lower class, worse off, and occupied by an influx of rodents. It offered East Plainsville the motivation and gumption to improve themselves and remain improved. This, in turn, lessened the West Side's residents' incentive to do so, and they remained in a static state of a kind of arrested development, in which they could only get increasingly worse. In fact, some of the West Side folk took a strange pride in the vandalization of their property, as if it were a badge of honor. However, over recent years, the West End had also taken some pride in their city and slowly refurbishing it, cleaning out some of the nasty, garbage-filled streets and fixing up old houses. This brought in new inhabitants into the city, and for the first time in decades, Old West Plainsville was experiencing a population boom. Though the children would peer through their windows and spot the shriveled-up grass and hole-ridden pavement, their parents would shield their eyes from it. Such a division caused a kind of fable, almost a kind of false simulacrum, to arise in each side of Plainsville. The members of the West, for instance, as facetious as it sounds, would spread rumors that their neighbors ate mice, lived only to middle age, and that their city water was infected with gas leakage. Some of these rumors the East Side spread about the West was that they ate raw meat, had gang-related violent crime epidemic, and that they harvested the organs of the deceased for nefarious experiments. Of course, none of this was actually true, but as Jean Baudrillard posited, the fictions told about reality often have more of an impact than reality itself. People were drawn to these infantile tales because they liked the idea of them more than the often boring truth they entailed. These tales merely gave them something to banter about over the weekend. This went for both sides. Neither of them actually had an accurate, dispassionate idea of what the other side was like. It was merely a whimsical rumor and various speculation. They did this purely for entertainment, to lessen the severity of the drab, waning, dilapidated streets of the West Side, and the East Side told such stories mostly to stave off boredom of pretentious suburban culture to find of any significance. Long-term prospects or meaning on to which to base their lives in affluent homes where the meaning of life was reduced to pithy Oprah shibboleths and Blavatsky-esque superficially positive quotes in frames suspended on the walls and as constant New Age reminders. What the well-to-do had was not enough to satiate them, and whatever the salt-of-the-earth pride of the lower class had was too destructive and too aimless to find peace. Despite its obvious issues, West Plainsville was nothing like East Siders made it out to be true. The truth is often a far cry from the pure hearsay, and as often takes a venture into the heart of a city, of a person, or a country, to see what state they are in. It is nigh impossible to draw such conclusions from the comfort of your home, or to draw axiomatic tautologies or utilitarian maxims onto which to base these beliefs. People are far more complex than they are portrayed by both sides of Plainsville. This was quite evident to Cameron as he analyzed the sheen of that fresh new hospital amongst the collapsing buildings on Main Street that had no hope left in them. Nevertheless, we must focus again on our story. Cameron waded through the firm, crystal diaphanous glass double doors, and felt the immediate sensation of heavy sanitation that usually comes with hospitals. He was both welcomed but put off by the acrid odor of cleaning solution and the cool air of the central air system, beneficently offering a constant flow of air. This is highly unlike his workplace, which was like pipe oven most of the time and rarely allowed for outdoor breaks. Cameron felt the privilege he was hesitant to claim as a right, but the satisfaction he had from these seemingly insignificant amenities that others enjoyed without resistance. He approached the desk of a receptionist, a middle-aged, dark-haired woman, flanked by a blonde-haired man roughly the same age, and a much younger woman with her face mostly obscured behind a screen. "Good afternoon, sir. How can we help you today?" asked the dark-haired lady, smiling vaguely, as if she were confused as to whether she should be upbeat or ambivalently content. "Hi, my name's Cameron Diethelm. I have an appointment scheduled for 1:30. The dark-haired lady smiled, this time with more overt enthusiasm. The blonde gentleman looked at his watch, despite there being a large clock right behind them. "Great," she said. "You're a few minutes early. Why don't you take a seat while you fill out these forms, and we'll ask Dr. Eakins to come as soon as possible." He handed out a stack of about 10 papers stapled together, with a complimentary stamp on the front face of them. The way the papers were organized was like a slap in the face, much like an epigraph poorly written as an ironic gesture rather than a congratulatory one. Despite this, Cameron soldiered on and began shifting through them, reading as thoroughly as he could before signing each necessary page. Suddenly, his side began to ache with rapid stabbing pain. It was the same rib that had bothered him on the night of the fearful dream. To make matters worse, his eyes began to fail him. Not entirely, as he could still make out objects and persons a great distance away, such as people sitting across from him, but he suddenly had impaired vision that stopped him from reading into even the bold typing and papers he was given, and he began to feel a great disturbance. A disembodied snicker was heard echoing from a considerable distance away, as if it was coming from outside, yet from right in his ears at the same time. It was a most familiar chortle he had heard, one that was high-pitched, impish, and almost childish, and he knew for a fact such a sound would never emanate from a child. He shifted around hastily and looked outside. No one, not one soul, was out there. He even walked up to the window and heard no more noises. Relieved, he scratched his head in befuddlement and returned to his seat. Was it something to be relieved about, though? Was he in the middle of going stark insane? It was one problem to have auteur disquieting nightmares. It was an entirely different thing to be losing his mind, especially in front of an audience. If he did that, he risked being put in an asylum, even if he acted his best, most sober behavior the very next day. So he refused to take that as an option and clung to his faculties as best as he could. But it was ever so difficult to shake off the sounds and sensations that were afflicting him so severely. He sat back down, dismissing the stares of the bewilderment from the other occupants of the waiting room, and returned dutifully, filing out his paperwork. His eyesight continued to bother him, but he remembered that he had a spare pair of reading glasses tucked away in his bag, fished them out after some struggle, and put them on. Now he could not discern anything within 10 feet of him, and wouldn't have been able to walk down a hallway and obviate oncoming traffic. However, the glasses helped a bit in discerning the print just enough for the salient letters to be coherent and readable, and to proceed finishing it within the next few minutes. Apparently, the gentleman and the lady behind the service desk were completely impervious to Cameron's travails, and they remained steadfast and immersed within their respective tasks. Finally, Cameron was finished with his paperwork, so he got up from his seat and handed it to the blonde-haired lady, who had been filing her nails, albeit discreetly, and took the papers he offered her. "Thank you. Dr. Eakins will be with you," she said with a slight air of boredom. As she spoke, the doctor bustled through the doors that led to the patient care facilities, wearing a beaming smile. His description didn't seem to match his voice on the phone at all. Cameron had expected a bland, average-looking man, but he had a quite charismatic appearance despite his somewhat monotone tone of voice. "Hello, you must be Cameron," Dr. Eakins said, as if there were anyone else who could possibly be mistaken for him. Then he led Cameron through a slightly ominous, unmarked door and led him down a winding path in which they almost had to slalom down precariously. There was remodeling work occurring in that particular area, and they both had to carefully make their way through various pieces of equipment. Even Dr. Eakins was thrown off by some of the obstacles. As they walked, he began asking some questions. "Have you been having any more of these kinds of dreams since we last spoke?" he asked, looking behind him intermittently, between watching his step. "Yes. Sometimes they won't be more than once a week, but this week has been particularly bad," Cameron answered, trying to recall the last time he had one while noting that he had indeed forgotten some of them. Moreover, he wasn't sure if this rate of nightmares was a good or bad thing. He followed Dr. Eakins into his office, which was marked by a bronze-colored sign hanging from the glass-paned wooden door. As he unlocked it and beckoned Cameron in, he spoke with some caution. "I did tell you that I would assign an eye specialist to assist you more directly with your issues. However, due to the sudden change in our policy, I am required to deduce your general health status first, before proceeding to a licensed ophthalmologist." Cameron nodded in compliance and followed him into his office, which was lit only by a few modest lights and primarily by the rays of the sun, which bled luminously through the windows. Dr. Eakins was apparently undecided as to whether he should shroud the windows with blinds or to kill the natural light or to keep it open. He settled for the Goldilocks conclusion, closing them only halfway. "So, as much as I'd like to help you," Dr. Eakins started, giving a heavy sigh before continuing, "I have to be fully honest with you, Cameron. We doctors are required to take the Hippocratic Oath, right? And part of that oath is being fully, 100% upfront and honest with our patients. I can help you, but..." There came that wretched phrase, "but." That word to end all words, that dreadful coordinating conjunction which reared its ugly pestiferous implications into every crack and crevice of reality, and stymied whatever potentiality they had within. The doctor went on. "My abilities are limited. I am a managerial physician through and through. I can walk the wards today and assist almost everyone in their needs. I can look at sores, bruises, compound fractures, hemorrhages, ulcers, you name it. I cannot guarantee you a thorough fix in the area of sleep or eyesight, but I can assess your overall health standing. Additionally, I was recently only a specialist referral doing most of the same tasks, but with less overarching responsibility. I was only recently promoted. I know it might seem like a cop-out, but I just wanted to be as open as possible. That being said, I have researched the best I could on this subject in order to be able to assist you. However, this isn't to say that I will have the authority to prescribe you any medication without first having consulted a proper eye specialist first. As for now, we will simply talk and get to the bottom of what's ailing you." "That's fine," Cameron stated placidly, though deep down he felt some minor turbulence, as he was not certain of how worried he should be. "As long as I get it looked at, that's all that matters." "That's right," Dr. Eakins emphatically responded. "For all we know, your issues might be as simple as prescribing the right medicine, diet, or habits, so why don't we sit you down and make yourself comfortable?" Cameron sat down, but the state of being completely comfortable seemed to elude him. The doctor did the perfunctory tasks, took his temperature, weighed him, tested his eyesight, and finally ran some lab tests pertaining to brain activity to be handed off to a specialist, who he assumed would be better suited to brain neurology. Then, all they had to do was await the results. After some considerable time waiting, Dr. Eakins decided to follow up with some more questions. "Well, I'd hate to make you wait in vain. I might as well call you back once you get these results, but I'd like to really get more in depth with your dream subject matter while we're at it. Let me just clarify that we will indeed set you up with a professional neurologist to cover these finer details that I cannot get to. What kind of things happen in these dreams?" Dr. Eakins took a seat, curled up his hands and rested his head on them, his eyes gazing downward, intermittently looking up, circling his hands around in a gesture of clarification when making a point. "Well, it's difficult to say." Cameron was being truthful. It was extraordinarily difficult task, attempting to boil down what he had experienced in a way that made any coherent sense. Eventually, he was able to find it within himself to explain. Mostly, time appears to be almost at a standstill, as if it's sludging onward painfully, slowly. Then, suddenly, something drastic or horrendous will happen, and it will end. But the whole entire time spent waiting in anticipation is the absolute worst. It's so clear and tangible, as if I'm waiting for a real-life event to transpire. But in these dreams, it always takes even longer, to the point where it's no use counting time. Not that I could even do that, but it's like time is arbitrary. I'd say that waiting is honestly the worse than the surprise itself, because at least the surprise is brief, then it's over with, if not painful. Yet it's that feeling of waiting for something that you cannot anticipate, something you can't understand or elucidate. It's the worst kind of feeling, to be robbed of hope completely. I understand. Dr. Eakins looked downward, casting a stare at the hardwood floor below him, especially when Cameron mentioned being robbed of hope. Is there anywhere in your life where you feel like you've been robbed of hope, or mistreated in such a manner that might have compelled you to have these visions or sensations? In other words, is there any instance of your daily life where you have experienced any kind of loss of freedom or potential? Well, there is my job, which can be very stressful. Over the years, I've worked hard. In fact, if not as harder than anybody else there, but success in that field seems improbable, if not impossible. I show up to work every day, never missing a beat, only offering my best, but it seems that no one really takes any notice of it, especially my boss, who has sort of a vendetta with me. It's like I'm a kind of ghost. I walk past them and they see nothing but a hazy apparition. Lately, even my friends have been turning on me. I don't think there's one soul in that office that respects me. Then again, maybe I'm to blame. Maybe people don't respect me because deep down I have no respect for myself. Sounds like a very difficult situation, Dr. Eakins began. Often dreams will become a kind of reflection of an ideal reality or wish fulfillment, as Freud, Cameron interjected. Yeah, I read about him earlier, he added, glad that they were roughly on the same page. Yes, exactly. While it's very tempting to toss Freud's theory into the dustbin of psychology, it's really challenging to escape his ghost entirely. While his premises could often be regressive, biased, reductive, and personally driven, he did have a number of things to say about how our past, namely our childhoods, builds a foundation on which almost everything else in our lives is predicated. Though we repress these desires, as he posits, they inevitably come back to haunt us in various unstated ways, such as rationalization or wish fulfillment. To go on a bit of a tangent that might not be scientifically sound, he hypothesized that dreams became a fulfillment of one's repressed desires. In analytic psychology, there is a constant battle of one's ego, superego, and id, or as Jung preferred, the unconscious and the conscious, and the long, belaboring process of individuation, or melding those two seemingly irreconcilable spheres into a healthy median state in which the individual self can finally accept their subconscious without having to truncate it. As you can tell, much of this is very metaphysically focused, and we can often lose sight of the real world and causes that might boil down to simple change of a diet, or as Ebenezer Scrooge puts it, you may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, or a crumb of cheese, a fragment of undergone potato. In other words, we must get to the material, physical root of the issue as well. Though it is never easy to parse out the mind and body dilemma, if there is anything else within these dreams that can help us understand more coherently what they might be telling you, or what message you can garner from it. For starters, Cameron began apprehensively, there is one common figure that shows up in my dreams a fair amount, and it's one of the most vivid, obvious ones. It's hard to describe it because the creature is so bizarre. So it's a creature that's been upsetting you? Dr. Eakins inquired, now succinctly clicking his retractable pen ready, anticipating whatever notes he might take. Yes, Cameron said softly, a very eerie, sometimes alluring creature that can pour out endless babbling on exegesis, praxis, Marx, Hegel, and a host of different subjects. I can't even remember. He'll philosophize for 1 hour, preach for the next, assert mathematical or logical propositions, and finally recite poetry with a tear in his eye. I think I should also point out this thing was also in the shape of what looked roughly like a large eyeball with a slit for a mouth and one large pupil at the center. His voice transitioned to an almost whisper that was barely audible, yet Dr. Eakins paid the utmost attention. This sounds like a very particular description. Often, we project images in our dreams that are very peculiar abstractions or augmentations of things we see in reality, but are too quotidian to be noticed. It's a subconscious, repressed realm that we exhibit those details to excess, and that is where we often witness grotesque actions play out that seem very real. What exactly did this creature look like? It's so ridiculous, I don't know where to start, Cameron confessed, hiding his face from tentative embarrassment with his hands. It's all right. There's no need to be ashamed of it. We must start the process somewhere. If you told me this thing looked like Mr. Potato Head, I wouldn't take you any less seriously. After some thought, recollection, and a deep sigh, Cameron began. Well, he had a very elegant outfit on, though it varied from time to time. It was kind of similar to an 1800s Regency gentleman, with an ascot tie, embroidered jackets, button-up silk blouse, and a very fancy-looking cane. He was very short, but had an outstanding gait, and his accent was very precise. He used erudite speech, as if he was from England, particularly London, though he did use a number of French, Italian, German, and Latin phrases. Later, he told me that he had been to all these places, in Switzerland as well. So my suspicions are that he picked up his dialect from a variety of countries. He sounded very educated, although he did use some lower-class obscenities every once in a while, just to rile you up. He spoke for a very long time about where he came from and how he came to be what he was. He claimed to have been on a train from Switzerland to France, I believe, when he heard thunder and lightning struck, causing him to transform into this thing. Did he have a name? Dr. Eakins inquired, lifting his pen from his notebook to listen. He called himself Mr. Tiberias. He never gave me a first name. Wait, scratch that. He did give a first name, but it was so ridiculous and elaborate that it slipped my mind whenever he mentioned it, and never mentioned it again after his introduction. In fact, even his origins were obscure, and he covered everything in mystery. It's impossible to tell, even if this had been in real life, how much he was speaking the truth. Most of the time, I didn't even bother questioning or debating him. I simply accepted this whole experience as one big, strange nightmare and never considered the possibility of treating it as if it weren't. I was waiting to wake up and forget that anything happened, but it wasn't that simple. The details, as you know, stayed with me and felt so real. They felt realer than real. In each of them, I felt myself to be transported to a large open sewer, shrouded in darkness. Sometimes, the setting was simpler. I'd fall asleep, hear a humming noise, witness a dark void, and the next thing I know, I was there. The other time, it was more difficult. One occasion, I was transported through a horrifying world of geometric, non-Euclidean space, where shapes and tetrads of differing objects converged without trouble. And he'd go on for hours at a stretch, hypothesizing about truth, math, and philosophy. He had a very lively wit, and would twist the meaning of words and phrases to his liking, and spin them back at you. Countless times he'd go on tangents about art and religion, but would never reconcile or deduce anything from them. Mr. Tiberias was, or is, a walking contradiction. He appears in my dreams and imparts wisdom and advice, but never takes responsibility for his own life. I even saw glimpses of other characters around him who claimed that he had manipulated and deceived them. He would briefly mention having made a deal of some kind many years ago, the details of which I don't know the slightest. He would drop the subject as soon as you brought it up. That was the trouble with him. There was no telling what he was, as he could have taken so many different forms and lived through so many different time periods that he almost didn't have a solid identity. There was another creature that appeared in my second dream named Mr. Spencer. He took the shape of an enlarged ear. He was very weak and feeble-looking. I felt pity toward him because he was cut off from his wife and home, or at least that's what he told me, and there was a very strong sadness to him. His life had been nothing but pain, and he claimed to have been one of those I've mentioned who were misled and to know someone else who had been lied to by Mr. Tiberias. I see. That sounds very much like an analogy to the repeating archetype throughout history and cultures of a tragic hero, one whose life is cursed to abysmal pain and suffering from the hands of fate. I wonder if Mr. Spencer is an embodiment of some kind of artistic intuition within everybody to paint the same themes and tell some cautionary life lessons again and again, said Dr. Eakins, rising from his reclining position he was in prior to a straighter one. Exactly. There were countless symbols within these visions. There was one repeating idea throughout, a kind of call to action. This I-man challenged me to stand up to my boss. Every time we'd meet, I would tell him of my latest interactions and how much progress I was making in trying to assert my status in the Hegelian master-slave dialectic and overcome class struggle, as he put it. Did you? Dr. Eakins probed, looking up from his notebook. Yes. But, now look at me. I don't have a job. Well, I'm temporarily on unpaid leave. Well, I guess whatever Mr. Tiberias is, figment of my imagination or not, he wouldn't care one lick if I had a job or not. He'd probably just tell me it's a capitalist scheme meant to keep the proletariat in the dark in a constant state of class struggle or something. So this eye creature was imparting Marxist ideology? Dr. Eakins asked. Cameron nodded vaguely, never breaking his almost catatonic, blank stare forward. This could very well be a manifestation of a kind of compensatory fantasy conceptualized by Adler, except offered in a dialogue from wherein he is suggesting real-life action on your part in order to gain a sense of worth or meaning in this constant busy world. It's interesting how your dreams are encompassing a very real part of your life. It's as if they are offering new edification, not found elsewhere. Typically, a person has a dream or a nightmare, and it's over with. They think nothing of it. Or at the most, it will offer a kind of evolutionary Bible stimuli toward action. But you're telling me that this creature, so vivid and idiosyncratic, is conveying original, concise, though at times obscure, information? Yeah, it's as if my mind is trying to keep some greater malevolence at bay. Like there's something deep within myself that may be murky or incoherent, but frighteningly recognizable. Maybe, in Mr. Tiberias, despite all appearances and oddities, I recognize a part of myself. It's like staring into a dark, deep pond and seeing your own reflection, but the image is so twisted and maniacal. Because ultimately, that's how I see him. Also, that is how I almost see myself in some ways, though the image is so remote and opaque. He might be trying to show me a version of myself, what I could be if I chose. But underneath the calm demeanor and chick words, I see a mad, demonic entity brimming with malice. On that note, I looked up on demonology as well, to see if I can find any similarities between him and devils and demons, but I've yet to find anything concrete. I know it maybe sounds superstitious to me, to a more educated, respected person like you, but I'm really running out of ideas. There's no need to feel any inferiority over your actions. 100% brutal honesty is the key to making this work. I apologize for the over-intellectual argot myself. I'll try to refrain from any psychological lingo and keep the questions simple. In fact, I should certainly refer to a psychologist, not to make any assumptions on your mental health, but only to help you further in this area. Did you feel like you learned anything from him? Was there a kind of intuitive process by which completely new knowledge was picked up? If we rambled on Kant, for example, does it feel like you learned any more about that subject? Yes and no. I never recall encountering anything in my day-to-day activities through which I would absorb information of that quality. I just work my job and go home. I don't delve too much into these subjects I mentioned, Cameron said, with a voice that was beginning to sound enervated, but not because of Dr. Eakins' questioning, but from the task of trying to explain himself. Was there maybe a kind of subconscious or subliminal background source in your daily life through which that type of knowledge could be learned? Dr. Eakins seemed to be trying to exhaust every angle of this predicament. Not that I know of, Cameron asserted. I only go to work and back home for the most part. Maybe a small gathering with friends. Nothing too much. But this eye even seems to be able to see into my own life. How so? Dr. Eakins asked. Well, he would know if I wasn't living up to a promise. He would even be able to mention certain people from my own life that he would have no way of knowing. For example, he knew about Mr. Singer, my boss, before I even told him about my job. It's like he can see into my own personal life and point out details that were hazy even to me. He had a way of seeing how things would play out. This is why this situation seems to be so difficult. It's hard to pin down what he is. He is as real as he is unreal. Cameron said this contritely, now almost out of breath. A dark shadow cast over both their faces as a host of clouds masked out the sun, and the natural light diminished a great deal. By the looks of it, a storm was beginning to form. This prompted Dr. Eakins to turn on more lights, which took Cameron's eyes off guard slightly, so that he winced reflexively. After doing so, he plopped back down in his office chair, folded his hands, looked upward, and said, "There's nothing to be ashamed about in admitting our dreams. After all, they are the very foundation of reality, and truth itself begins in the mind, the place for dreams and visions, and reality is simply as a dubious grasp and reflection of our ideas. To write off dreams as hogwash is to diminish the very essence of our characters and how our own minds work. It's to insult our nature to imagine, create, venture, and dig as deep as we can into the void of the unknown valleys that are our psyches." Cameron folded his hands, too, and rested his weary head on them. Finally, he felt a semblance of comfort. Someone had understood him in this peculiar situation. He was not being laughed or scoffed at with skeptical derision. He was being listened to and helped. It was late in the afternoon now. Dr. Eakins said that he would prescribe him some medication that would assist him in sleeping more smoothly. For now, Cameron would wait for the results, hopefully more assiduous in his play. The fact was that he was making progress, no matter how slight. Even he was on the right path toward bettering himself and his livelihood. However, what he couldn't count on was the ineluctable, elusive nature of his meetings with Mr. Tiberias. He wasn't expecting them to continue in the way that they had been. How would he avoid them? Could he avoid them? These were just a few of the kinds of thoughts that haunted Cameron through his last days before returning to work.